Hey comfy crafters, it's Allie here, and today we are going over the exact process that I follow when I do any of my hand embroidery projects. We are going through step by step, so if you've never embroidered before, this is going to be a perfect video for you. So let's get right into it. Let's start out with supplies. There are a few must-have items that you definitely need to get started, and there are some items that just make embroidery a little bit easier but are not necessary. I'm going to put the links to everything I use down in the description. The first thing you'll need is a couple different sized embroidery hoops. Both wooden or plastic hoops work well. It's really a personal preference. I usually just pick the hoop that will fit the shape and design of my pattern the best. The next thing you'll need is embroidery floss. DMC brand is my absolute favorite. I feel like it's just the best quality thread out there. You can keep your threads in the skeins that they come in, or I personally like to use these little plastic bobbins so that I can easily see all of my color options and they don't tangle when I store them. I also like to have several different sizes of needles depending on how many strands I'm using. Really, any sewing or embroidery needles will work just fine. You can use regular scissors to cut your fabric and your thread, but personally I like to use pinking shears to cut my fabric to keep it from fraying, and these sharp little embroidery scissors for cutting my thread. You'll also need some type of fabric to embroider on. For beginners, I recommend 100% cotton or canvas because they're both really durable and don't have too much stretch, which makes it very easy to embroider on. As a budget option, you can use something around your house like an old pillowcase or a tote bag to practice your stitches on. I always use a pattern of some kind so I can see exactly where to stitch and make sure I get the look I want. There are a couple different types of patterns like water soluble stick and stitch paper, or you can trace your designs with a heat erasable pen. We'll talk more about different ways to transfer your designs in a little bit, so stay tuned. If you are looking for the designs featured in today's video, I will link to the patterns that are available in my embroidery shop, but feel free to draw your own designs or use some of the many free options out there. Now that we have all of our supplies ready to go, let's move on to prepping our project for stitching. First, choose the hoop that will best fit the design that you're planning on embroidering. So for this project, I'm using my smallest wooden hoop, which is 3 inches. Hoops have both an inner and an outer hoop, and the fabric will sit between the two. Cut a square piece of fabric that is a little bit larger than the hoop you're using, and we are going to place that over the inner hoop. Then we're going to push the outer hoop on top of that and keep tightening the hoop and pulling the fabric like this until it gets nice and tight. You know it's ready to go when it sounds kind of like a drum when you tap it. Our hoop is ready to go, and now we have to transfer the design onto our fabric. Option 1 is stick and stitch paper. Personally, this is my favorite option and what I use on most of my projects. This is also the best option if you're working with a darker fabric where tracing won't really be easy to see. So you can buy these pre-made stick and stitch patches or stickers like the ones that I sell in my embroidery shop, or you can buy the paper and just print whatever designs you want at home. All you do is peel off the backing and stick it on your fabric, and you stitch right over top of it. Then when you're finished stitching, you just rinse it off in some cold water and it dissolves away. If you do choose to print them at home with a regular inkjet printer, which is what most of us have, I would recommend using a really light gray color like this so that the ink doesn't bleed when you rinse off the stick and stitch at the end. The next option is simply tracing the design right onto your fabric after printing the pattern on regular paper. Some people use a light pad for this, but I usually just tape it to a window and trace from there. It's totally fine if you just want to trace the design with a pencil and you won't see the pencil marks underneath your stitches when you're all done. The last way I recommend to transfer a design, especially if you don't have a printer, is to just pull up the design on your phone or an iPad and trace it from the screen. I would recommend tracing on the back side of the hoop like this so it lays flat against the pattern for more accuracy while you're tracing. You can also trace the design with a heat erasable pen. What I love about these pens is once you're done with stitching your design, all you have to do is apply a little bit of heat from an iron or a hairdryer and the ink will disappear. Now it's time for the really fun part, which is stitching. So grab your embroidery thread and let's go. Embroidery floss is actually 6 tiny strands of thread. So if you see instructions that say use 3 strands, that means that you need to separate your threads to however many strands you need. If you use all 6 strands, it will be a little bit thicker and it won't take as much time to fill a lot of area. For this example, I am going to use all 6 strands. First, we're going to cut our thread to size. I like to go from my hand to my shoulder, which is probably about 3 feet. I just find it's a good length to work with. And thread your needle and tie a knot at the end of the thread. I personally like to use the quilter's knot, which is basically just wrapping the thread around your needle like this and pulling it through, and you get the perfect knot every time. But you can also just tie a normal knot. You can start with just one simple stitch called the back stitch. So take your thread and start from the back of your hoop and push the needle through the starting point. The back of your hoop will look something like this. And we are going to push the needle back down and pull through the back. And there you go. You just did a back stitch. We're going to push it through a stitch length away, pull it all the way up, and then this time push back through into that same hole from the last stitch. So now I'm just going to show you a few more stitches so you can get the hang of it. Next, we're going to learn brick stitch. This is the exact same as backstitch, except it is my absolute favorite filling stitch, used to fill up an area like a block letter or a shape. After you do the outline with the backstitch, you're going to come back to the beginning and start another row of backstitch as close as you can, adjusting the length of your stitches a little bit to look like a brick wall. So the trick to this is just adjusting the length of your stitches to make sure it stays in a really nice offset pattern. And you just keep repeating that until the entire area is filled in. The third stitch I'm going to share with you is the split back stitch. This is my preference for a nice flowing line or anything that's a little bit curvy. It's very similar to the back stitch. You start the exact same as the back stitch with this first stitch, but this time, instead of pushing down into the same hole as the last stitch, we're going to push down through the middle of the last stitch, splitting it in half, which is why it's called split back stitch. Then we're going to come through a half stitch length in front and come down again halfway through the previous stitch. I'll show you a few more stitches so you can see how it looks. And just with those 3 stitches, you can do pretty much any design. You don't need to know a lot of stitches to start. So for this design I'm working on, I used split back stitch for all of the outlining, and then I used either brick stitch or back stitch to fill in these little disco ball areas. I also have this design available as a digital pattern that you can download and print. Once you get towards the end of your thread, you will tie it off on the back of your hoop. I like to leave a decent amount of thread as a tail to work with, especially as you're learning. I tie a little knot, and I like to use the tip of my needle to hold the thread in place to get the knot as close to the fabric as possible. Then just snip off the tails with your tiny embroidery scissors and you've completed your stitching. A lot of people keep their projects in hoops to display them. I usually embroider more on clothing or totes, so I don't really have to finish them often. But if you want to temporarily keep it on your hoop to display, just trim the fabric and do a simple running stitch around the fabric, pull it tight and tie it off. Or if you want to more permanently keep it in your hoop, you can use hot glue to really stick it down so it's really secure, but then you can't reuse the hoop, so I don't really prefer to do it that way. Here is the finished project following my exact embroidery process. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Don't forget to check out the Comfy Crafting embroidery shop. Hope this was a helpful video. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment below. If you want to know a little bit more about how I embroider on clothing specifically, I think I'm going to make a new video about that. I hope you followed along, and I hope this gives you the confidence you need to just get started. It's okay to make mistakes. You don't need a whole lot to get started, and you can really embroider on anything you already have. Thank you so much for watching.